Today you will be seeing one of the most beautiful games in chess history. Hence it is worth the while to stay until the very end, as it is always the case with my videos, of course. Let's start today's lecture with a very general question. What is chess? Of course there are many different answers to this question. One would be, chess is a game of advantages. When playing chess you want to collect advantages. But now comes the second question. Advantages of what kind? Advantages in what? I think it is helpful if we exchange the term advantage with the term value. There are four areas of value in chess: material, pawn structure, king safety, and piece activity. So when playing chess, you want to collect values in one or several of these areas. In my opinion, piece activity plays a dominant role, as all the other three areas relate to it. Now, piece activity can be subdivided into two parts. You can either try to increase the activity of your own pieces or reduce the activity of your opponent pieces. Very often you achieve both at the same time, for instance when gaining spatial advantage. But sometimes you can focus on or should focus on one thing at a time. For instance, can you restrict the opponent's pieces by certain alterations of the pawn structure, or you can play in a very prophylactic style to take opponent's possibilities out of the equation. Well, Anatoly Karpov, he definitely is a master of reducing the activity of the opponent's pieces. Well, there's a rationale behind this approach, because if you do that, then nothing bad can happen for the time being. You can then later still improve your own pieces and increase the activity of your pieces. So Karpov's approach has a lot to do with control. If you want to study playing in a very controlled fashion, adhering to the laws of prophylactical chess or restriction, you should definitely study Karpov games. And this is what we are doing today. Karpov Unziker, Nice 1974, this was an Olympiad, is a very famous game. It is known from many books, and actually I lectured it now for, I would say, 20 years. Time to get very candid about it. It's nothing new anymore, so I can present it here. There is no secret about this game anymore. But I think I have some interesting remarks to say, because it is not always the game what is important, but the comments and the way you interpret a game. So Karpov is playing the Ruy-Lopez variation. Unziker answers with the main line a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1. Now, as the e-pawn is defended, white of course threatens to win black's e-pawn by bishop takes c6 followed by knight takes e5. Hence, black has to do something about it, for instance by playing b5, bishop b3. And now Unziker played the main move d6. But I would like to say that here the best move, in my opinion, is to castle, with the idea to play the Marshall gambit after c3, d5. This is called the Marshall gambit. I played e5 as a beginner, like most of the beginners do, but I returned to e5 many years later after having played Caro-Kann and Sicilian. I returned to e5 at the end of the 80s, built or based upon the Marshall attack. And yeah, I was also quite successful with that. Then later I moved away from e5 again for the Sicilian, but that's another story. So d5 is actually the move the engine favors for black. After e takes d5, knight e5, takes, you see black has sacrificed a pawn, but now is about to play the bishop to d6, and then there are a lot of pieces, a lot of black pieces looking to white's kingside. This is the Marshall attack. Actually, the engine prefers not to play the main move c3 here, but suggest moves like h3 or a4, the so-called anti-Marshall, or d3. But if you kind of frustrate white's intention to play the main line by using this move order, you already achieved a very important goal, because c3 followed by d4 is the most dangerous line for white. So in any case, if I was black, and even if I intended to play d6, the next move, I would start with castling, putting white into guessing mode. And many white players, they don't like the idea that black can play the Marshall attack, and then they play one of the more timid moves here. Okay, let's go back to our game now. Unzicker played d6 directly, showing his hand. As I mentioned, I would castle here. There is no drawback to castling and keeping white in guessing mode. So now Karpov played c3, castles, and here white has to play very patiently. There is a move d4, but this would be a bit premature. After bishop g4, pinning the knight, putting pressure on the d-pawn, black can equalize quite easily. So h3 is the best move here for white. And now there is a big choice for black. There are many lines. In our game we see knight a5, the Chigorin variation, but in modern times top class black players prefer to play other moves. So bishop b7, this is called the Zaitsev variation, d4, rook e8 followed by bishop f8. This is one option. The other option is the Breyer variation, knight b8. Looks a bit funny to redeploy the knight, but d7 is a much better square for the knight, as now the c-pawn is free to go, and also if the bishop is on b7, the bishop is not handicapped by a knight on c6. So, but in our game, Unzicker played the oldest move here, the Chigorin move, the Chigorin variation, knight a5. Attacking the bishop, so bishop c2 is forced, and now c5. That is the idea of the Chigorin variation. But the Chigorin variation has some drawbacks. The knight on a5 is now misplaced. Knight on the rim is grim, as you know. Queen c7, defending the pawn e5. And here the main move is knight bd2. This is what Karpov played. An interesting alternative, however, is the move d5, in order to bring about the same pawn structure as we will see in this game, but preventing black to change the pawn structure as he could have done. So d5 now would see quite the same position as in the game, but with black having 2 extra tempi. But the structure is closed, hence time is not of the utmost priority here. And this is a nice line here to gain space and to claim a slight advantage for white. That's quite a modern move here. But the big main line, the more traditional move, is knight bd2, keeping the tension and leaving it to black to decide what he wants to play. Now the best move for black, I guess, is c takes d4, cd4, and now to play knight c6. The knight is centralized again. White has like half a pawn advantage here, so also a nice position for white. But what black did is giving white more than half a pawn advantage. Unzicker played the direct retreat knight c6. Now I played through, like many chess friends, the games of Bobby Fischer. So I acquired the book My 60 Memorable Games when I was a young chess player, and Fischer always played d takes c5 in this position, d c5, and then knight f1, and the knight is headed for e3, and then either f5 or d5. There's a hole on d5. So when you play through these games of Fischer, you're quite fond of this structure, and it has a lot going for it. But objectively, black can equalize. This is what modern theory says. So after knight c6, the better alternative is to play d5. This is what Karpov did against Unzicker. Gaining space with gain of tempo. Now black has to decide what to do with his knight. He went to d8. Let's have a look at the alternatives first. One move would be knight a5, going back to where it came from. Now white should not make the mistake to play knight f1, because black could play knight c4, and the knight would have a good square on b6. The bishop would be placed on d7, and black's pieces would be arranged in a very harmonious fashion. Instead of knight f1, white should play b3, and now black's knight is caught on what I call the horror axis, a5, b7, d8. This is also the topic of our game, as you will see. This is a very bad knight on a5. There are not only bad bishops, but also bad knights. This is a fantastic example for this concept of a bad knight. So b3, strong move. Then there is the alternative, knight b8. So the knight then wants to go to d7 and then either to b6 or to c5. Of course, for this to happen, black would have to play c4. Again, black's knight would have some very good prospects. But white can use the momentum and play a4. Now a takes b5 is a threat, and that is black's problem. He has to play bishop b7 in order to protect the rook. But now white can play b3, and this is a very nice motive in the Ruy Lopez in this very pawn structure. The pawns a6, b5, they are very fragile, and white can attack these pawns with queen e2 and bishop d3, finally forcing black to abandon his pawn b5. But if black takes on a4, the a6 pawn will become vulnerable, and the square c4 will become accessible for white's knight. So now let's go to our game. After d5, Unzicker played the move knight to d8. Of course, this is not a very appetizing place for the knight, but the knight wants to go to c5 after black playing c5, c4. Another option is to play the knight to f7. Of course, for this to happen, black would have to play something like knight e8 and f6. So now Karpov played a4, putting pressure on black's queen side, threatening a takes b5. Now you should not abandon this structure, because after knight c4, you see what I also indicated in another line just before. The pawn a6 is now vulnerable on the open a file, semi-open a file, that is. Of course, the a4 pawn will be recaptured very soon, and then the a6 pawn is weak. Also, the square a5 is interesting for white's knight. Maybe it will end up on c6 if black does not cover this square. Then there's also some tactics. Let's make a zero move, h6. That's my zero move here. And now we see the tactics white has available. He can take on e5, d5, d6. By the way, this is some tactics, or like, let's call it a maneuver, because it does not net material. It's just an alteration of a pawn structure. This is an alteration Capablanca once played in one of his games. So because you gain the two bishops, right? And of course, the c5 pawn now is weak, the a6 is weak, e5 is also a bit fragile. So this brings white a clear advantage. For this reason, black is forced to play rook b8. By doing so, he abandons the a file. So it is a little victory, like a partial victory, I want to say, for white. Now white is in control of the a file, as black had to remove the rook. Now Karpov took on b5, which is okay, but I want to draw your attention to the move b4. I think this is a novelty. I'm not 100% sure, because when I analyzed this a couple of years ago, it was a novelty. The idea is to play as in the game, but without opening the a file. So black cannot challenge white on the a file and maybe exchange rook there. So this is an interesting alternative to the move a takes b5, which happened in the game. A b5, and now we have a key position. In every game there are many key positions where you have to be very astute, where you have to be aware of what's going on, because you can force the game into certain directions, or you can prevent your opponent from doing so. Black is now intending to do something good for his knight. This is the move c4, and then he would follow up with knight b7, knight c5 with a good position, because c5 is a fantastic square. The knight would radiate towards the squares b3, d3 and e4, as you can see. Here we have to play a prophylactic move, one way or the other. This is a trademark of strong players. They just try to frustrate their opponent's plans whenever they can. Top players play very prophylactically, and Karpov is known to be one of the most proficient prophylactical players in chess history. He was a pioneer in a certain way. I mean, before him, other players did the same. Petrosian is also known for his prophylactical style. And nowadays, every 2,700 players has these abilities of Karpov, but we are talking of Karpov of the 70s, right? So he was really strong at this, in this discipline very early on. So we have to do now something about the move c4, and Karpov chooses to play b4. It's an okay move, and I always attached an exclamation mark when commenting this game, or showing this game in front of an audience, which I did, like, as I said, 20 years ago already. But I think nowadays b4 is maybe not the best move. There are two other ways to prevent black's idea. So b3, I think, is a very good move. Maybe b3 is stronger than b4. And if now c4, we can either take on c4 and then target the c4 pawn, or we can now play b4. And as you can see, there is no knight b7, knight c5 available anymore. Another idea is just to play c4 to block the c5 pawn. It's also a good move. Okay, Karpov played b4, and now after c4, the square c5 is not accessible for the knight d8. So this move b4 is geared to leaving this knight here in a very passive situation, right, on d8. It's a move against this knight, right? So a nice prophylactical measure here, b4. Now there was a game prior to this one 1 year earlier. Karpov played Spassky in Moscow in 1973. Spassky played c4, and Karpov played knight f1, knight e8, knight h2, f6. This is a plan to play the knight to f7, but after f4, Karpov had a nice space advantage on the king side, and also right now is in charge of the a file. So this together is giving him a clear advantage in this position. Unzicker deviated from that game by playing knight b7. So the knight is now not going to f7 but to b7. Knight f1, bishop d7, bishop e3. So far so good. And now rook a8. You can see here black has no problems to oppose his rook in the a file. This position is quite okay for black. I mean, it's a bit passive. I would like to play like this with the black's pieces. It's very defensive. Now white should have played bishop d3, rook fc8, knight g3, and this is a plus equal position. Nice for white, but playable for black. But it is true, black cannot really win this position, and that's why it wouldn't be really fit my standards here with black. But if you are a very solid player and content with a draw with black, you can play like this. So after rook a8, Karpov played differently. He didn't play bishop d3 but queen d2. This is a mistake actually. Rook c8. Now we see there's a threat in the c file. C takes b4 would win 2 pawns, as the bishop c2 is a target down the c file. So the bishop has to move away. And now I can show you how black could have almost equalized. He could have played c4, bishop c2, knight e8. This is now a very straightforward line. It's an engine variation. I show you how the game could have unfolded if Unzicker would have played the right way. Karpov is gaining space here in this line on the king side, but look what happens now. Black can exchange his bad bishop. This is a typical maneuver, bishop d8, b6. And after that he can also exchange one pair of rooks. And white doesn't really have anything anymore. I mean, his only idea would be like a g4, g5, but he couldn't do it now because then g6 would win the bishop. And then black has the a file, right? So this is really nothing anymore for white. Actually, when I presented this game like 20 or even 10 or 5 years earlier, I didn't have so much intel about what was really going on. So I changed my comments when I prepared this game for today's video. So here you have Stockfish 15 intel. You have really the truth of the game. Okay, let's go back to bishop d3. Unzicker played g6 here. So c4 would have been better. g6 is not the best move. Now knight g3. Now he should have played this knight e8, bishop f1, f6 idea in order to bring the knights to g7 and f7, as indicated with my green arrows here. Instead he played bishop f8. I mean, it looks like a normal move, but allows white to improve his position. White is now playing rook a2. That is a very interesting motive, right? If you have like a file, an open file, which is contested by both players, you can try to gain control by play the rook now up one square in order to double And of course, if black would take on a2, white would be in control of the a file. But it's still a playable position for black, because the a file alone is not really that dangerous for black. This is plus equal. But here black made a mistake. Black played c4, releasing the tension. And this now gives white a clear advantage. But now white should not play bishop b1 as Karpov did, but rather bishop e2. Actually, when I commented this game earlier, right, I always said bishop b1 is necessary because black's only active idea consists in playing f7, f5, and the bishop should therefore stay on this b1, h7 diagonal. But today I'm smarter than that. Today my view is that f5 can be allowed because f5 would only make things worse for black. Let's see. Knight e8, rook e1 takes f5 question mark. Takes queen c2, and you see black's king side is under pressure. Now black doesn't only have to worry about the a file, maybe white's rook penetrating on the square a7, but also he cannot really keep his king side together. And if he plays now f4, then knight g5 would be winning. This actually is also true for many lines of the King's Indian. Funnily enough, this closed Spanish has a lot in common with the King's Indian, which is a d4 opening. You see, openings should be looked at in terms of structure rather than variations. If you have this logic in mind, you can find analogies very often, and then you can find your way around by just beaming information from one very remote opening, like a d4 opening, to an e4 opening. But you can use that knowledge and make the right decisions. So they have a lot in common. This is a very King's Indian-like structure that we see here on the board. And also in this King's Indian, f5 sometimes makes things worse for black, as white has a space advantage, and his space advantage gives him the better chances to exploit the position being opened up on the king side. Now let's go back to our game. Karpov played bishop f1, which I now give a question mark actually. In the books you see, or you find this game in, I'm sure there will not be a question mark unless they are very up-to-date books. Yeah? But all books which are older than 5 years or so, I think don't comment properly on this game. Now, Unziger played queen d8. He should have taken actually pardon me, this was a bit quick. He should have taken off one pair of rooks. So if black reduces white's attacking potential, because white wants to attack on the king side, by exchanging one pair of rooks, he can defend much more easily. If white now plays something with f4 later, he surely is missing the second rook to apply a lot of pressure on black's position. This position is plus equal because there is no way of breaking through on the queen side. So for instance, if queen a7, black could play rook b7, right? White has to combine potential play on the a file with kingside play, which he did in the game. But now he has one pair of rooks less. In the game, Unziger played the move queen d8, and that is a mistake. I think his idea was to take on a2, and if, let's say, queen takes a2, then to play rook a8. That was the idea of queen a8. Now please pause for a moment. and think about your next move with white. So press on stop, press on pause, think for yourself before I show it now. I spoil it for you. Now comes the most important move of the entire game. This is a move the game stands for. Okay, I will show it now. It is a move bishop a7, double exclamation mark. So this is Karpov's trademark. Normally a7 is not the typical square for the bishop. That's why it is so difficult to find, unless you have seen this motive. Actually, I have looked up this motive with a search function in ChessBase, and I found more games with bishop a7. So people learned obviously from Karpov and copied him. But I still owe you the question, why is this move so strong? Why am I making so much fuss of this move here? So the idea, it's in the restriction move, right? It restricts black's rooks. It blocks black's rook. It is not possible to exchange on a2. And now the idea is to shield white on the a file. So white can now double rooks there. So white wants to play bishop c2, double rooks, and then maybe later withdraw the bishop again after he has seized complete control of the a file. Or alternatively, black or white just wants to keep the situation as it is and just wants to prevent black from exchanging rooks. Maybe white needs the rooks on the king side. We will see. So this is really the key move of the game. Unzicker played knight e8, bishop c2, knight c7. That's a bad move. f6 would have been better, but I don't want to go into every detail here. It's not necessary. Rook ea1. Now white is in charge of the a file. And for black it's a bit difficult because he has always now, from now on, to reckon with white withdrawing his bishop, let's say bishop b6, in order to penetrate black's position with rook a7. It's quite annoying if you always have to calculate this with every move. Yeah? And white can do it or not. White doesn't have to calculate it, only if he really wants. Yeah? White is not depending on that possibility. Queen e7, bishop b1. Here bishop d1 was better again. I show you again what happens if black now plays f5. f5 now again is a mistake. So the bishop, of course, is not really nicely placed on b1. It is looking at the back of his fellow pawn here. The only purpose is to prevent f5. But if f5 doesn't have to be prevented, you can play the bishop to a better diagonal. Now, what happens after f5? Takes. Bishop b6, now we see the bishop withdrawing. Now the idea is to either take on c7, gaining control of the a file, or to play bishop c2, attacking the now soft spot f5. So black has now some vulnerable points on the king side. His king side is open and the f5 pawn is the weakest spot. But there are also other soft spots. I mean g5, right? h5, the knights can go there, and maybe you see the knight coming to e6 later. There are a lot of bad things which can happen for black. So the engine says f4 is black's best move, but after bishop takes c7, rook a2, rook c7, knight e4, white is winning because he has now a very dominant control of the light squares plus the a file. Okay, let's go back to the game. Queen e7, bishop b1. Well, bishop b1 is improving the coordination of the pieces. Now, white could play the rook to a3 and then the other rook to a2 and then maybe the queen. And we saw something like this kind of happening in the game, at least in some variations. Then later the queen could be placed on a1. So this would be complete control of the a file. This setup, by the way, 3 major pieces on an open file with the rooks in front of the queen is called Alekine's gun. This stems from the game Alekine against Nimzowitsch, San Remo 1930. So Alekine's gun is now in the cards here. Bishop e8, not the best move. Knight d8 would have been better, but who cares actually? It's not so important for enjoying this game. We don't have to go into all details. Now knight e2, knight d8, knight h2, clearing the f pawn. And now black should have played f6, f4, knight f7 with a clear advantage for white, but not yet one position. Instead, black played bishop g7. It's a doubtful move. f4. So this is a principle of the 2 weaknesses, or the principle of the 2 fronts, if you so will. Of course, white is clearly better in the a file or on the a file, but this alone wouldn't yield victory. Now you have to open up another front and then play simultaneously on 2 parts of the board. As white has a space advantage, he can then much better maneuver from one side to the other, or maybe strike simultaneously at both sides, and black would be overpowered as his pieces are much less active and he cannot really deal with a war on 2 fronts. That's the reason why white is playing f4 here. And now black should have taken, let's have a look, e takes f4, knight f4, and white is very much ahead here in this position. For instance, bishop h6 looking like a good pin doesn't work for tactical reasons, because we have knight takes g6, bishop d2, knight e7, that's losing. So instead black should play f6, let's say queen f2, knight f7, the knight is heading for e5, rook a5, bishop d7, bishop b6. This is what the engine deems to be best here. So this is a clear advantage for white, but still playable for black. The knight a8 now doesn't make a good impression. d6 is weak, but at least black has an outpost for his knight on e5. So black can still fight here. It's not yet lost. But Unzicker made a mistake here. He played too passively. He played f6. He wanted to play for fortress, obviously. Now Karpov, he gained more space. Karpov loves to have a space advantage. So if you want to study space advantage, play through Karpov's games. You will be rewarded richly. So f5, gaining more space. Now black should have played knight f7, intending bishop h6, knight g4, preventing bishop h6, and again white can claim a huge advantage, but I think it is still a draw at this point in time. Now Unzicker made maybe the final mistake, because now we can claim a 1 position for white. This position is not a fortress, as I will show to you. Bishop c2. Karpov now relocates his bishop because he has spotted a soft spot in black's position. Then this soft spot is the square h5. White wants to penetrate black's position via the square h5. Now the big question is, can black not simply close the position by playing h5 himself? So the idea is, if white plays g4, we close with h4. If white plays h4, we close with g4. Is this a fortress or not? The answer is no. Because now white will be able to open up both the H file and the G file. So this is a funny thing, it's a bit paradox. You know, the pawn was here on H7 and white can always open the H file by playing H4, black then plays H6 and then Hg5, Hg5, and then white would have the H file at his disposal. Now, intending to keep the entire kingside closed, paradoxically, as a paradox, right, both files will be open. Now you might wonder how this is going. I show you. Knight G3, white will be now training his pieces to the pawn H5. Bishop F7, Bishop D1. Now the pawn is under attack. Black can defend still against this threat, but now the queen will join the game. Bishop F3. By the way, Bishop B6 now also wins, so this sort of Damocles, removing the bishop at the right moment in time. Right? This would be here one of those moments, Bishop B6. This sword would now cut, but we can also just stick to our kingside plan and play Bishop F3. For instance, King F8, and now you see black is forced to move his pawn. But after this, there is no fortress anymore. White's next move will be G3, after which black would have to take on G3, because if not, white takes on H4 and then wins the H4 pawn. So later, white will play H3, H4, exchanging his H pawn for black's G pawn, and then both of the files would be open, and you see white has a lot of space advantage there and could just penetrate with his pieces on the squares H6 and G6. Black would be completely lost in this position. For this reason, black cannot play H5. Hunziker played Bishop F7, Knight G3, Knight B7, Bishop D1. There the bishop goes. Now, of course, we have this square in mind. Now, Hunziker played H6. Well, maybe it's a bit compliant to weaken the square G6. He could at least have waited for H4, right? But it wouldn't have changed a lot if he had played, let's say, Queen E8, because Karpov would have played Bishop F3, followed by Queen E2, and then placing his bishop on H5, and then his knight on G4, also winning. Okay, Hunziker played H6. Karpov penetrated the position with his bishop, and he wants to pave the way for his queen or knight. They will then invade black on the king side. Queen E8, Queen D1. This is a nice square. He could also have gone to E2. Doesn't make a big difference, but he has something in mind. He has Alekhine's gun in mind. Knight D8, and now typically Karpov, right? Rook A3. So Karpov is really a very patient player. There is no need to hurry. He completely dominates his opponent here. Now he just improves his position slightly on the queen side, just in case he might need it. Actually, he doesn't really need it, but there is a good argument for improving wherever you can improve. Also look at it from a psychological point of view. When you dominate your opponent, you don't want to force matters. You want to let your opponent be confronted with his miserable position, right? So he is then maybe talking to himself, like in terms of, oh, how could I only have ended up in this position? So he's beating up himself, right? Which will weaken his forces. I mean, in this position it doesn't really matter anymore because the position is plainly won. But there are positions which are only clearly better, and then you want to make your opponent suffer a bit to weaken him psychologically as well. So rook a3 is a good move in any aspect. King f8, and now you see the queen could, in case it is needed, go to a1, and I will show you a line where this makes sense. But as I said, white can also do without the move queen a1 at all, right? What I love with this position is also the fact that Karpov uses the queen in a modular fashion. There is this kingside module and the queenside module. So the queen can be applied to the queenside module by queen a1, but it is also here connected right now with the kingside module by being able to move to h5. So it's a nice approach. You can put the queen behind two different pieces, right? King g8. Black can only wait and see, and now it's time to clear the square h5. Now Unziger captured with the knight. Let's have a look at queen takes f7 as an alternative. Now is the right time for bishop b6. Rook b8 takes, and now we see white penetrating on the queen file. Rook b7. Now queen h5 would win, but so does knight g4. Let's say king f8. And here you see the queen joining the rooks on the a file. So I promised you one line where this maneuver rook a3 and then rook a2 makes sense. White is invading black's position. Black can only wait and see. And now you see how beautifully the knights are arranged on the king side. They are like parasites in the fur of a bear or in the skin of a rhino, you know. They are really itchy now for black because the bishop cannot move. If the bishop moves to f8, the f pawn would fall. If the bishop moves to h8, the h6 pawn would fall. The king cannot move. The king has to stay with the bishop, cannot move to f8 because the f6 pawn would fall again. So these knights are really annoying. Queen e7, queen f5. Black is actually in Zugzwang. Black now is forced to give way with every single move, and white makes progress. So rook c8 is not possible now. White would just win the b pawn. That's clear. So black has to play knight b7. It's the only move remaining actually. Queen b6, knight d8, and now after queen b8 we have complete Zugzwang here. Every move black would now play would lose. Now the knight d8 is hanging, but you cannot play king e7, the bishop g7 would fall, and if you move the knight to b7, queen g8 would win. So that's a nice demonstration for combining kingside play with queenside penetration. Unziger played knight takes f7, and now the queen came to h5 actually. The queen is very efficient on both wings. Now the move Unziger played was knight d8. Let's have a look at the move knight h8, because in the game Karpov could penetrate on the square g6. Now of course the knight is protecting the square g6, but of course the knight stands very miserably on h8. Now I show you a very nice Zugzwang variation. Knight g4 attacking the h6 pawn, takes, king f7, look at the knight h8, but also the bishop cannot move without losing a pawn. Bishop f8, then knight takes f6 of course. And now we move the bishop away from the a file, takes, rook a8. I mean here the threat is obviously rook a7, so black has to exchange rooks. Takes, and now unfortunately, I mean for pure aesthetic reasons that is, the move bishop d8 would also win, right? We could just win the f6 pawn. But the more beautiful move is bishop a5, because this is Zugzwang. Black cannot move any piece anymore without losing a pawn. But actually white is not really, apart from the planned bishop d8, white is not really depending on the Zugzwang motif here. He can also win by playing the knight to a3, winning the pawn b5. Okay, now let's finish our game. Unzicker played knight d8 and not knight h8. And now Karpov played the queen to g6, exploiting the soft spot there. King f8 happened. And now after knight h5, Unzicker resigned. Of course, now black would have to take the queen. There's the threat, queen takes g7 checkmate. But the thing is, after queen g6, fg6, look what happens now. The knight h2 will be played to f5. And then it's even difficult to keep the bishop g7 alive, right? Apart from the fact that h6 is weak, f6 is weak, and the d6 is weak. And white could also play bishop b6, invading in the a file. This is the final position of the game here after knight h5. Unzicker resigned on move 42. And the funny thing is that the entire game, Karpov didn't even have to remove his bishop from a7. The bishop stayed there until the very end. Well, I hope you liked this game. Write into the comments whether you did. And then, yeah, I hope you learned a lot, and see you next game then. Bye bye.